here with Robert Collins again, round two, Robert. And now Robert's with the LEDC. You're kind of head of workplace development. And last time we talked a lot about that, about the
Mm.
employment situation in London, the challenges that companies face, challenges about transport. You know, I think that's important. But part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you, I got to know you years and years and years ago. But I do think you and I have both been around long enough that we've actually seen the conversation around poverty changing,
Mhm.
right? It seems to me it more and more, it's kind of this thing that we have to attack as something comes up. Like let's say homelessness gets too
Yes.
much, we have to do something about it. In the past, when I was younger, and probably for you as well, there was the idea of the federal domain, the provincial domain, the civic domain, and how they cooperated together to tackle some of these great problems. And one of the things that's always struck with me, and I'd be interested in your point of view, is there's never been more money going through Canada than there has been in the last 10 years.
Mhm.
We've had so much in the way of funds being made here or transferred through here or whatever it is. But back in the old days, that money would largely stay in Canada.
Mhm.
And therefore, from that, social action, environmental action, those kind of things would come from that. But now a lot of it kind of eludes the Canadian grasp and ends up overseas,
Mhm.
which suddenly leaves us with less to be able to maneuver, to be able to work towards our problems. But I would be interested, Robert, in hearing about your journey. You talked about how you first came here
Yes.
as an exchange student, which is
Yeah.
great. But your view of poverty, not just your experience, but your view of poverty, how much has it changed over the decades?
Mm. I think it's. I think the good thing is I think we understand poverty in a more nuanced way now than we did before. I think it was a more black and white issue. Um, it, it, 30 or 40 years ago, and it was sort of more. It was sort of an accepted structural fact that there would be people who were poor and disadvantaged. And there was the sense that, yes, there were charitable supports, and government would provide some means, but there was more the sense that individuals still needed to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. If I want to give it that sort of lens to it, I think we've now come to realize uh, that within poverty there are so many different dimensions to it. So is it the 75-year-old female whose husband has passed away, who had who basically really just had CPP as their
Hmm.
level of support, and then she might have not had worked and then very much qualify for CPP, so she's struggling in her own maybe modest home to cover increased costs with very modest means. So in other words, there's the people over working age who I think are as our costs go up, which significantly we're seeing sort of inflation at the moment, without the means to. Then we have, if we think about looking at our downtowns, we see people with mental health issues and addictions, with perhaps a growing level of addictions, without necessarily the local means to address those. Where we used to have a psychiatric hospital here, which provided residential supports, and now I think we have less supports with more individuals needing support. So somehow we've sort of got some things sort of out of balance in those populations. We then look at, and this is where sort of it gets very tricky, is everybody means well, I think, to try to address them, but do things actually work?
Yeah.
So we have, for instance, uh, efforts to increase the volume of affordable housing, but are they in locations which are in resilient communities? Whereby, and what I mean by that is, do you suddenly add a significant population which needs significant supports, that then overwhelms the local infrastructure? And we do that because it's convenient to build in large amounts and or the cost of land, without necessarily getting back to the fundamentals. Is this community will this school, will the volume of people that we suddenly introduce change the complexion of the school's ability to provide a resilient environment and with the appropriate supports? So to me, it starts with a little bit about our land use planning. It starts with our ability to be receptive and engaged, and then to look at how funds flow. I'm afraid I am a fan of a guaranteed annual income as a starting point, and obviously the adequacy of that. When I look at things like social assistance, where I think our caseloads are around 10,000 in London at the moment. And there's about close to 5,000 to 6,000 new applicants every year. People at least knocking on the front door saying, I need help.
Yeah.
And then the caseload itself, approximately 50% of it has been on that caseload for over 2 years. And remember that the Ontario Works caseload was supposed to be sort of an interim means of support for individuals. I haven't seen much change, unfortunately, over the last 20 years in terms of those volumes or people. There are people who are moving forward from those systems. It's dynamic, but I'm not sure it's as progressive as we would all want it to be as a society. So I've said an awful lot there. Okay. I mean, there's so many different dimensions and so many different pockets of needs.
Yeah, and you've got a lot to say, which is important. I think when I look at, like, one of the things that I did when I was in Ottawa, study federalism and how it all came about, the various political jurisdictions, economic jurisdictions, those kind of things. And, back when federalism was first designed, 85% of the people lived rurally. Mm-hmm. Right now, yes. Over 50%, well, 80% of Canada are in cities. So it's totally flipped.
Yes.
And but when you develop an economic sharing system, like we used to have the Canada Assistance Plan, the CAP, and the idea there was that the province and the feds would pay 50-50 to these social costs or whatever. Cities were kind of the runt of the litter. They were kind of there at the end of the table waiting for the crumbs that would come in their direction. Sometimes they were included, sometimes not. So cities got together and formed things like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, right? Mm-hmm. Or the Ontario Municipal Association, because they wanted a seat at the table, because the stuff that was really happening was happening in their jurisdiction. The policy, though, and the monies was often happening at a senior jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that federalism itself has really not well adapted to the modern era. In other words, we're afraid to tackle it because of constitutional reasons and other things. But it also seems to me, with cities playing much more of an important role in this, and cities still having no ability to really tax, right? But to have to go to the senior levels of jurisdiction for the significant amount of money for the significant problems, whether it's transport, which I know is near and dear to you, or whether it's housing or whatever. Like, I just wonder how much we can actually adapt as long as we have got a structure that was once premised on most people living rurally. I know it's changed a bit, but also, the idea of a 50-50 split between province and the feds. How do you feel about that?
Well, because I worked for the City of London in several different roles, and I'm a strong advocate for there to be various different means where actually it's at the municipal control to address those needs, rather than to have to spend a lot of time filling in applications, et cetera, to the province and to the federal government. Yeah. So in other words, because what happens is an awful lot of funding gets chewed up in writing reports rather than delivering service. Yeah. And that sort of going cap in hand to those levels, I think is not a good use of people's time. And I just wonder just how because I've worked in the political system, and I remember meeting with some provincial civil servants regarding Winterio funds, if you recall those.
Yeah, yeah.
Way back when, we tried to encourage the province to think about some of those funds going directly to the municipality to then make the choices rather than government. And the provincial elected officials at the time said, why would I do that? I won't be able to cut the ribbon, or I won't be invited. So somehow we have to change the reward or recognition system of the political level to allow for that recognition to happen, or that connectedness to happen, if that's such a driver.
Yeah. Jane and I were with Paul Martin when he was actually finance minister under the Chrétien government, and we were visiting him one day at his home, and he was just developing the gas tax, right? So what he wanted to do was that cities, he went and spoke to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. They complained because they were not getting funds directly. So they were saying this to Paul. So what Paul had designed was that gas tax money, he wanted to send it through the province to the cities. The provinces did not want to share it in that way. So what Paul did is, for a small amount of it, he gave it directly to the cities, which is still happening to this day.
It is happening today, yes.
Yeah, the political furor over that was really something else, right? Because as you said, one jurisdiction wants to get as much as they can to be able to do what they can. But I never forgot that. But in every one of those discussions that I was part of, the cities always seemed to be the people with their hat in their hand. Right? They weren't seen to be equal partners, even though the majority of the population in the country were there. There's just something seems wholly unfair to me about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and that's where, I mean, I am impressed with how with the right spirit, how the different political stripes can come together and work on common issues when upon occasion. It's not as routine. And there's good efforts, I think, from the municipal level to have regular meetings with their federal and provincial elected officials to establish their perspective and to share it. But how it actually translates, though, into and the time lag. I think it's the time lag between the need and then the program, then the application, then the delivery. So if you think about that sort of 3 to 5 year cycle, it's just not nimble enough to address the as you mentioned earlier, the current increasingly urban environments.
Some of the, can I just ask you about that, though, because you know more about this than I do. I presume at the municipal level, one of the problems is it can really change depending on who is elected, right? I mean, that's also true at the federal and the provincial level. But I mean, look at something like, say, transport or something like housing, and I want to get into those more with you, but those are significant funds, of which the city doesn't have to cover it, right? So you can go ahead as a city and you hear from agencies and businesses and others all coming to you and saying, we want this particular thing. Let's say it's an environmental thing, whatever. And then all of a sudden you say, okay, and you're open to that. Then we get into this time lag that you're talking about, right? Where all of a sudden there could be municipal changes due to elections. And the people coming in, although they're still maybe kind of tied into that, are not nearly as interested. Do you see that as a problem?
I do, but I do also, I was very fortunate to work for the province when we were really encouraged, supported, and reminded that we were a professional, neutral civil service. And it is the role of, and I believe it's a very important role, that the civil service at each level of government does have to point out the issues, the constraints, and the directions of the community. So there should be that counterbalancing. I think it's important that the politicians do bring what they're hearing from their constituents and their So how do you actually, it's that quality of that relationship to inform and have a healthy exchange. That's critically important. And the more that we have sort of, how should I put it, some fiber into the civil service, that's their role, then I think, how should I put it, the whimsical side of the political spectrum is less influential, right? Yeah. In other words, civil servants look beyond the 3, 5, 4-year term in terms of what's needed, but it is a you know, how should I put it? It is a push-pull approach, which tends to, when you have those political horizons, tends not to necessarily serve communities as well as they could.
Yeah. So, Robert, you know, I've been around as you have been, but you know, I've been through a few recessions as director of the food bank, right? And food banks got started in the 80s recession, right? First one was in 1984 in Edmonton. Ours was in 1986. It got started. But really, the devil in the details really became the deficit or the debt, right? So in 84, 85, 86, for instance, the idea was, okay, we'll get through this recession, then we'll go back to where we were. And that never happened.
Right.
And food banks started then and then had to stay on because we weren't able to return to that. Then we've had a few recessions afterwards, plus the Great Recession in 2007. And each time the justification for cutting back on social programs was the debt or the deficit. Now, there was political ideology involved in all. I get all of that. But this time, with COVID hopefully ending, but with us with, you know, just a massive debt, there is going to be the tendency for governments and maybe civil service to say, if we're going to pay for everything, there's going to have to be some cuts. Do you worry about that in part because of the size of the debt? And politically, there's always going to be a desire to, you know, cut certain things. Do you believe that the civil service will be able to hold the line on that at any of those different jurisdictions? Will they be able to keep that?
I think they will be pointing out that most of those funds that come through get recycled into communities. In other words, it's not as if those funds are being banked.
Yeah.
They're not being popped into investment funds or whatever. So then the appropriate portion of GST, property taxes, et cetera, and creating employment. So I'm hoping that the understanding that those funds that government provides to individuals, et cetera, and to the supports for individuals really stay in those communities. It's not that they're being transferred out. So, and that a certain portion of it, I don't know what the percentage would be, actually does come back to each level. Yeah. So I'm hoping that those arguments will, you know, will hold.
When you I'm hoping with you, but I'm not sure.
But you see, you look at sort of, you know, there's like look at what London has. I mean, we have things like Clothing Works and others to help make sure people have the appropriate clothing for interviews. We have the food bank, and you've moved to a much more distributed model. We have those fantastic churches and others who are providing that regular schedule of meals. But still, we know, I mean, and you can update me on the food bank. My recollection was that if I was to go to the food bank, I could probably only go maybe once a month. And I could only probably get about a 3-day food supply or something in that nature, which means, but I think the public thinks because you exist, then nobody should go hungry. But actually, the actual volume that people can get, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the actual volume isn't quite there to provide more than that, given the volumes of people knocking on your door.
That's correct. And in those days, that was just the food we were getting.
Yes.
Right. Now we're getting a lot more food, and so they're including fresh. So now we're able to have hampers that last a lot longer.
Good.
Right. But also, I think we always felt it wasn't just the food bank, you know, that there were other places that people could go to. If it was just the food bank, then that would have been a pretty problematic situation. But you're right. I mean, the way that the food bank handled all of that gets people to think, well, I donated, it's covered,
Yeah.
and it's not.
Right. And that's what I think we have to sort of keep reminding people, that we have wonderful services in the community, but
Yeah.
they're only sort of serving a certain volume of people,
Yeah.
and not the complexity. And I'm going back to that initial sort of comment that I made around those different, what are those different segments? When you say poverty, I think I think everybody has different pictures of what that means, and who's involved, and what the implications are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think we've I don't think we've sort of really realized how difficult it is to help people in, if you're in a short-term straitened situation, it's different than a longer-term familial history of not knowing how to use services, not having confidence, not feeling that there is, that you can change your circumstance.
Yeah. So in the 5 minutes we got left, I
Yeah.
want to return to something that was near and dear to you, and we never really got to fully cover it last time. But let's say I'm one of those people that I'm in a situation that's kind of fluid. I don't have the funds to get by so I can get help with services, but I'm trying to work.
Yes.
Or I'm trying to go to Fanshawe to get upgraded,
Yes.
or whatever.
Yeah.
The problem is getting from A to B in London is often really difficult because of transport.
Yeah.
And I know that that's really important to you. In the area of poverty, can you just go over with me why you think that is so vital? I think we know, but we want to hear from somebody who knows this stuff.
Well, first of all, just think about, if you're at just think about when you're starting out looking for employment, for instance, you're likely to be, for instance, you might be going to if it's say to a manufacturing environment, you might be asked to be on the cleaning detail, which is at 11, which often might be at 11 o'clock at night or later, and to be done by 6 in the morning. So can you get to that employment setting? And how long is it going to take you from your location to get there? Yeah. And then is the transport for you when you leave? And then, so both the toll it takes in time, but actually having that physical means of getting there. I'm so pleased to see St. Thomas and Stratford and others are doing some really interesting on-demand systems to deal with some of those outside hours. They haven't got quite to the sort of 11 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the morning, but there is more with technology. There are more opportunities to develop effective systems. We've been very fortunate in London to have an approach in industrial areas. And London Transit, in their budgets, are trying to now increase access to transit to those areas, which will be much needed, because at the moment, we will be challenged in attracting any more employers unless they can see that practical means in place.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, so we've got to, those are sort of some of the fundamentals, right? So access to transit, access to Fanshawe College's great series of programs at each of their currently three London campuses, and maybe more to come. It's important.
And I presume with the service industry,
yes,
increasing or the hospitality industry, or whatever it is, as those things increase and become increasing parts of, municipal operations. Like, I've had 3 kids that have all worked at McDonald's, but it would be a 3-hour shift here and a 4-hour shift maybe in the evening or whatever it is. The ability to get from A to B, that is also very complicated, I presume, for the service industry, which does not necessarily run on a 9-to-5 schedule. Yeah,
exactly. So it's that flexibility that's required. And as I say, I think that there are means. I was fortunate. I grew up in England, and so if a bus stop at a central location wouldn't be on the outskirts of a mall in the cold. It would actually go up to the door of the mall, and there would be the variety store, the dry cleaner, the whatever, as part of that. In other words, public transit was used by everybody. It wasn't just people who didn't have access to a car. and they were in convenient locations where you could actually get other ranges of services.
Yeah.
So I think we have to reimagine how we, especially as London, as you mentioned, as London becomes more urban, how we use those major nodes and plan those more carefully to be more people-centered, rather than segmenting people, being more inclusionary.
I agree. So in the couple of minutes we got left, I've got a question I shouldn't be asking you, but I'm going to anyway. Given the fact that we see the poverty situation becoming more protracted, more complex, more difficult to deal with, the political world is more turbulent, economic, global stuff is more turbulent. Do you have hope around the poverty file? That I'm not saying that everything will be 100% answered, but we'll seem to be able to get enough of a handle on it that we're moving through now into a way of dispelling it. Do you have hope for that?
Every day. Well, and the point is, I keep meeting people who are trying to make a difference.
Yeah.
You know, whether it be within United Way agencies, whether it be within the City of London, within the province, there are people who are aware of the circumstances of others, and who want to make a difference. And especially when I meet with people from 16 to 30, their sense of wanting to change the both environmentally and being more inclusionary, that they don't think about telling me about somebody's race or whatever. You know what I mean? They've just grown up in a different world than perhaps it was like 30 or 40 years. So that gives me a lot of optimism.
Yeah. Well, I struggle with it. I've been around a long time, as you know, but where I do feel hope is in talking to people like you.
Yeah.
I see you as a multi-sectoral kind of person. You've got a lot of experience in a lot of different fields. And I think that kind of more nuanced or global view needs to be brought to these problems that we have. And so I'm really glad you're there. I'm glad the LEDC is also helping in many ways look into these sectors. And like transport is essential to dealing with poverty. I think things like housing, work, all of those things are essential. So I'm just really glad you're there, Robert, and you can give people like me an education. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Glenn. Always good to chat with you. Thank you.